My name is Rich Schmidt. We're here with Trevor Smith. It's January 27, 2026. We're at the Nicholson Library at Linfield University in McMinnville. Trevor, thank you so much for joining us today. The first question we want to start you with is why wine?
Why? That's the first question. That's a big one. No softballs to start, you know. Favorite color, green. Favorite food, chicken schnitzel. But why wine? I would say, I first heard this, it was said by an Englishman, and I didn't realize this when I first got into wine, but later on down the road it kind of came. He said, he described wine as kind of, as like having this kind of hedonistic pursuit mixed with like academic rigor, which I thought really summed it up for me. You know, and it's something that, and again, that's not how I got into wine, but hearing it kind of articulated later on made a lot of sense, and kind of, you know, the short answer, that would be it. Mm-hmm. You know, you have harvest where, you know, doing all the hard work, long days, hard physical work, cleaning, and then, you know, you have the harvest party. Mm-hmm. You get to have a good time, and I feel like that kind of theme of, you know, working hard but then enjoying something nice at the end of the day was kind of consistent throughout. That being said, I got into wine kind of by happenstance. It wasn't planned or intentional. You know, I grew up in Eugene, but wasn't really exposed to wine at all as a young person. My family weren't big. I mean, they drank a little bit here and there, probably in, you know, special occasions, Thanksgiving, but it wasn't a regular fixture at the table or anything. But then I got a job at a liquor store in Texas, and not like a corner liquor store, like a Night Train and Thunderbird, but like a big box store, like Total Wine. It was called Goody Goody. It was in the Dallas area, and I got into that while I was going back to school to become a teacher. And so I got into that, and just was a cashier. But they had a wine department. They had all sorts of wine, and I noticed, you know, the wine consultants, they kind of just, you know, they wore nicer shirts. They got to hang out and taste wine and talk to customers, and I thought that was cool. And then also you got, they had these knowledge tests, so if you took the wine test, you got paid a little extra, and then you got to go in the wine department. So I started taking those, and, you know, got into the wine department, and, you know, really liked it. Starting to get exposed. They had all manner of styles from all over the world, which was really good. It was kind of a good initial education. And then I had been doing that maybe just for like a year and a half, and I started to get into like the Court of Master Sommeliers. You know, that was kind of a good entry point too. I had never worked in a restaurant up to that point, and I still haven't. Is that true? That's true. I've worked in tasting rooms, but it was a great, you know, I did their intro course, which was awesome, you know, and I even went on to do the certified just to kind of learn the basics. And you know, as I started kind of educating and reading the books about wine, you know, people talked about going and doing harvest somewhere. So, you know, I was from Oregon originally, born and raised in Eugene, and I knew there was wineries back here, so I kind of started trying to get a job as an intern to start. It was a common thing, especially for wine professionals in the educational path. And so I reached out and got a job, ended up getting a job in 2010 at 12th and Maple Wine Company in Dundee. So that was my first harvest. That's when I first was introduced to the production side of things. So up until then, it's just been retail, selling wine, buying wine. Kind of got to know the 3-tier system and distributors and that whole side of it. And I had a good understanding of kind of the world, a general understanding, but a good one. But then came to Oregon, came back home and did that first harvest in 2010, which was great. You know, did one, and then it was kind of like, I loved it, you know, I'd kind of been doing it ever since. Mm-hmm. So it reminded, you know, it was the combination of, like, you know, as I said before, like working hard, you know, solidarity, long days, physical work, which I enjoyed. I was after college and before I get into wine, I was in the Army, and I was in a unit where we did these kind of deployments that were about 3 or 4 months. And, you know, when you were doing that, you were kind of had this singularity of purpose, this focus. You were just doing the job, and, you know, I really kind of liked that you could kind of forget about everything else. Everything extraneous would kind of fade away, and you just could focus on this one thing. That's what harvest felt like. So I really enjoyed it. So then I went back to Texas and worked a little bit more in that same liquor store. I should call it a wine shop, but then got a job the very next harvest, 2011 in Australia. So went to the Barossa Valley in Australia, worked with a small producer of about 100 tons called Dutchke Wines, which was great. I ended up going back there 3 years, for three separate harvests with the same place. Just wonderful people. Stayed with the assistant winemaker, got to explore Australia and kind of broaden my education that way, and really enjoyed that. That was 11, 12, and 13. Kind of an interesting anecdote. 2011 Australia was the coldest, wettest vintage they had had in like 100 years. Coming from Oregon, they blamed me. But yeah, I know they were joking, as Australians do, but it was a great time. But it was a real hard vintage. So, Australians are kind of known, they tend to be more, they can be very technical in their winemaking, kind of by the book, and they understand things. And so it was really good to go into a region like that and kind of see how they dealt with it. There were some bugs and some rot, and a lot of their harvesting is machine, so just them adjusting to those kinds of things was a very good learning point. It wasn't, I will say, it wasn't a lot of rain, being a guy from Oregon. I was like, what is the problem here, people? But for them it was. So, but really enjoyed that. 1 year got to travel around, go to Tasmania and Victoria and just see all the different regions. Got to go up to the Clare Valley, kind of more in the interior, and there's so many, and it was great, and really enjoyed that. In between each of those Australian vintages, though, I was coming back, I did 11 in Oregon. That was at Tory Moore with Jacques Tardy and John, but working with them was great too. And again, so 12th and Maple it's a big facility now. Back then it was still bigger than most, It was a custom crush facility, so they made, I think, we had several different clients, but it was maybe 1,400 tons, so a little bit bigger, more industrial in scope. And then going to Australia where it was 100 tons, it was very small, artisanal. It was 3 of us working there. And then Torrymore was the same kind of thing. It was all small fermenters. It was really working with Pinot on kind of a very small scale, Pinot Gris, Chardonnay, and also having an estate vineyard, which was really cool to see how they interacted with that, their involvement, picking decisions and things like that. And that was 2011, which again was one of the coldest vintages Oregon had seen. I think we still had fermenters going in around Thanksgiving, which was great for me because the job extended. That summer I had worked in the Torrymore tasting room because, the early days you're kind of you do what you got to do to make money and stay in the industry and stay up here. So worked in the tasting room and then got to stay on for harvest, and it was real late and real cool. And again, I don't think it was too out of the ordinary for a winemaker from Burgundy. Jacques was from, I think, Nuit St. George. He has a family domain there. So getting to kind of see how he dealt with it, he wasn't too fussed, although, word around the valley was, people were, there was some concern. And, you maybe see some, trucks with pallets of sugar and things like that. We certainly chapelized, you do what you have to. But it was a weird year because, it ended up being, I remember it raining like pretty strongly in August. And, this was early on still in my wine career. So I was still learning some of the chemistry. So I was like, oh, there's going to be high acid wines and low alcohol. But, we chapelized, and then come to find out, because it was so cool, we didn't have there was still a lot of malic acid, which, once you do, secondary fermentation, that all kind of went away. So we ended up having to, not necessarily a Torrymore, but ended up having to acidify a lot of the wines too, because the pHs would drop out. So that was an interesting technical aspect I learned working in a cool vintage, and to make sure, okay, we got to look at juice panels and consider these things. But really enjoyed that. I think I stayed on at Torrymore in the taste room and still really enjoy. I caught up with John recently, helped them bottle this last summer. So it's been great, and from there went, I think 2011, and then 2012 again went to Australia for more traditional. It was warm, and I kind of got to see how a typical Barossa vintage was, which was great. And again, continue to expand, visit places. Early in the career, you go out and you try and go taste as many places you can. When I first came to Oregon, started going out, and there were so many, and even now, since I've come back, there's even more, and so many that I haven't heard of, all these blue signs. I don't know how long you've been here, Rich, but it baffles me.
It's a lot of signs.
Where things are, and in Southern Oregon too, Eastern Oregon, the growth has been considerable. So, but which is great. I think by and large quality is still maintained. It's definitely when I first, it was kind of a frontier area and people were still learning, so, but still also very much that, tight-knit sense of community. So that was 2012, was again in the Southern Hemisphere, and then came back, and that's, I got a job at Antica Terra as an intern. And that's when things really started to blossom, I would say. I got exposed to kind of a different mindset in winemaking. Margaret Harrison, Andrew Riechers, who's my current employer, he was the assistant back then. And he interviewed me. And my experience was probably pretty limited. Antica Terra had a pretty good reputation, but come to find out, Andrew and I, we were both from Eugene, and we had a bunch of mutual friends, and so we hit it off, and ended up working together in 2012, which was just great. And that was kind of a turning point working there. If you know anything about it, they open a lot of cool wines during harvest. Like the exposure there is just unbelievable. Things I'd never seen or heard of or could afford really. And so that was really, it really opened my eyes in a lot of ways, and had a great time, loved working there. And that was even, Antica Terra is kind of known for the long hours and the rigorous, and it was just it was a different way of doing things that I really embraced and really enjoyed. So I did that in 2012, stayed in touch again. I've been fortunate, even from my first vintage at 12th and Maple, still maintain friendship, contact with these people. And you guys will see as I kind of continue, it goes, comes full circle. But that's probably one of the best things, the people you meet and you go back and you have some wine and talk about past vintages and all that kind of thing. It's wonderful. 2012 again, and then 13 I went again to Australia. So same place, and that I think was the year I got to go to Tasmania and Victoria and get to see that, and that was again eye-opening and wonderful. Loved doing that, but realized maybe I should try somewhere else. After 2013, came back to Oregon, and 2013 I decided, because of my exposure at Antica Terra, I realized I wanted to do it and be in wine production, but I also there was a gap. I didn't have quite the technical understanding, and I was friends with the people at 12th and Maple. I knew the lab manager there, and 12th and Maple had a great lab. They had set up a couple, I think. One guy was a geneticist, another guy had worked in wastewater, so he knew gas chromatography and high phase liquid chromatography, which I had no idea what that is or really what it is to this day, but I'm like, that's where it's happening. I don't think ETS was here at that point, so I was like, this is the lab. So I went and worked in the lab for a harvest, and I was kind of I was unfamiliar with that side of the business, so it was really just kind of a strategic move to be like, look, if I want to make wine, you got to know the chemistry, so got in there and got exposed to all of that, probably on a higher level than I was expecting. But the guy who ran the lab, he told me, he's like, hey, I can teach you things, you need to pick up, but it's all kind of taught and laid out, and he did. So that really broadened my understanding of that, just wine chemistry and things like that. After that, I started to go, I took some classes at Schmidt, but my undergrad, I went to school in Texas, it was in history, which, the soft sciences, as they call them. And, again, though, an English person once said, he's like, the liberal arts, the humanities is the best thing because it's a very broad education. I respect that he said that, but I don't know if I agree per se, especially looking back, being in a technical trade, maybe doing, chemistry. If I had all to do over again, I think it might be chemical engineering. I don't think I could pass the classes, but with AI, you just don't know. Let's not sell ourselves short. So but just, I worked with a chemist as we go forward. After the year in the lab, I was able to stay on at 12th and Maple in the cellar. I moved from the lab because I wasn't quite handy enough with a micropipette or a microscope or anything really, but I got to move to the cellar and spent a year. So that was the first year, the first proper year as a full-time cellar hand, seeing kind of everything post-harvest, pre-bottling. We bottled for a month. There's a month of bottling Pinot Gris, then you bottle Pinot Noir all summer. So it's putting oak on wine, it's doing micro-oxidation, it's doing transfers and racking. And so I really cut my teeth and learned under an exceptional cellar crew there. Doing a volume that it was maybe 4 of us. And we made a lot of wine, and we made it very technically precise. Which is an important skill to have. Most of the wine in the market, 90% of it is, the bottom shelf, your Franzias, your Carlo Rossi's, your Peter Vellas, these kinds of things, your Boone's Farm. I don't know if I'd call Mad Dog, I guess that's not real, but you know, so it's like that, most wine people consume is that. So getting to understanding that world, I mean, we used Franzia red blend or Cabernet as a lab base for, like, this is what we test for our pH for, you know, so I was like, and they are consistent, they nail it every time. So respect, you know, it is not easy to have that kind of consistency. So that kind of showed me, like, this is not, it might not be the most inspiring wine, but again, it's made in a very precise and technical manner, which is important to know how to do, or at least be familiar with. So, so I spent that year in 12th and Maple working in the cellar and work with really good people, kind of learned the nuts and bolts of you know, non-harvest cellar work, which is important if you want to be a winemaker. I mean, bottling harvest is a lot of work, you know, but I feel like the wine kind of makes itself, it ferments. You put it in something, it's going to ferment probably. You know, you have to guide it, of course, but then, you know, once you get, prepping for bottling is a whole different animal, really something where you got to watch it. The wine, it probably isn't vulnerable, it feels vulnerable, and you're like, anything I do could fuck this up at the very end, which you don't want to do. You know, you want to see it all the way through into bottle, which so there's always a little stress, and knowing how to do that and be comfortable with it, knowing, you know, DCO2 and DOs, and filtration, and, you know, what's a polysaccharide and why is it jamming up my filter when this wine has low turbidity, things like these. Like, you have to at least, you know, and not to mention labelers, which I have a whole, I don't want to call it sort, but I have a mixed pass with labeling machines. I thank goodness for, you know, Signature and the bottling trucks, they have it dialed, but when you have your own labeler, it can be a stressful situation. pH meters also, but we don't have to go into that. You know, you learn your strengths and then you move on. But so learning all that was huge. And then I kind of got to go to, I had got in contact with the winemaker at Screaming Eagle in Napa. So that was, you know, obviously a sea change of a place. And I had applied the year before, and I think they had been all full up. But, you know, in the U.S., in the wine industry, you've got to do your time. I mean, Napa is kind of where it all started. It's probably the most famous region, you know, it's a place you have to go do some time there. And I was like, okay, I'll go do my Napa vintage. And then I was able to get to do it at Screaming Eagle. You know, I was like, I've got to go spend, you know, be a pilgrim in an unholy land, as it were. It's all come to find it is not like that at all, you know, and I loved it. I ended up staying there. I went to Screaming Eagle in 2014. So, and got along with the winemaker. The winemaker, again, was a guy from the Pacific Northwest, from, I think, the San Juan Islands, and we hit it off. And it was great. I mean, still friends with everyone in that crew for the most part. One guy in France, probably don't keep in touch with him as much as I should. But again, we were like tight crew, small crew, and, you know, making arguably what's considered one of the greatest wines in the world, you know, which was great. And like I said, got along with the winemaker, got to stay there. He asked me if I wanted to stay, and I was like, I will stay here. This is not what I thought. Napa's lovely. You know, I was living with my friend who I worked with in 2012. I worked with a guy, and his parents lived in Napa. So, and I was supposed to just stay with them, like, temporarily, but I ended up moving in, and they were like my parents' age, so I was like living at home again and eating beef stroganoff, and I loved it. And he was in the wine industry, and he had all these old Napa wines, so I got to drink wine with him, you know, work at Screaming Eagle, and then start to get exposed to all these, you know, all these kind of iconic labels you hear about, but, you know, if I'm being honest, even back then I couldn't afford, you know, and part of the impetus of working at Screaming Eagle was like, I think it was maybe $850 when I started there, not to mention the long waiting list, but I was like, I'm probably not going to get to try this, except on unique circumstances unless I go. So that was part of the reason just to go and see and you know, end up getting to. And but like I said, it was me, the winemaker, and then the assistant winemaker, which was quite a character from New Zealand. It was just the three of us most of the year round. And then you had the cellar crew, which was just an amazing cellar crew, like some of the best guys you could ever hope for in the vineyard crew. And then and it just had a great time. I ended up staying there. That was 14, 15, and 16. So 3 vintages, you know, got to like blend with Michael Roland, which was great. You know, to just kind of see his process and, you know, at first thinking, well, who is this guy with this expensive jacket? I mean, we can do this, you know, but to see him work and then to blend with him and be like, okay, respect. Like, it was impressive to see, you know, because I had watched another formative kind of bit of input I got was I'd watch Mondovino where they show Michel Roland, excuse me. I have a tendency to say things wrong. It's intentional sometimes. But in Mondovino, he's always, he comes up, he's not the most likable person. And he's always telling people to micro-oxygenate and everything. And then to see him in person, it's obviously a totally different thing. And it's very impressive to see him work. And he works with a lot of people throughout Napa, and it's an impressive skill set, I have to say. So that was great. It just, again, exposure to these things and growing grapes in Napa, at the highest level, and getting to taste, and meeting a lot of other, the winemaker at the time, he was young, still is, he's younger than I was, and there were a lot of these kind of young, like real bright and real enthusiastic, and wanting to learn and wanting to push the industry, like how do we get away from conventional farming and irrigation and tractor passes and all these things, and really taking care of the land, which was a huge movement down there. It still is, which was really impressive to see it. And also, to be fair, like Napa, there's a lot of financial backing, there's a lot of investment, some of the money that backs these places is substantial, and so there's really kind of no expense spared. You got to see some of that, like what is possible at that kind of level, where nothing else is, where money's not an object, where you can do anything you can. Like if you need to keep your grapes warm with a helicopter, to stir up the inversion layer, you can rent a helicopter for 2 hours. Not that they did that, I feel like that story might be from Bordeaux, but that's just kind of the scope of what they could do. So that was fascinating to see. And spent 3 vintages there, like I said, 14, 15, 16. 15 being kind of, according to Michel Roland, being one of the best vintages in 40 years in Napa, which was really cool. I will say, vintage consistency there was much higher than it is in Oregon. If you go from 12, where we had this ripe, rich year, to 13, where we had, the tsunami coming from the Pacific and getting types of rot that we had never seen before. It was, there's big swings in vintage, whereas in Napa, there's more consistency. They certainly, 11 was a cool year, 10 was a coolish year, 12 was more classic, but their variation is a little less than ours. So, and again, if you want to learn about a place or a region, for me to learn it is to go there. Like I've read about, the Barossa in Australia, and you read the great wines and the styles and all that, but then you go there and you meet the guys and you see everything, and you realize, oh, there's a big difference between this mechanical harvester and this and a Palanque. Like they do different things, and the winemaker, and so you really, to learn is to go there, which I feel like, for any advice to a young person in the industry, like get out and go and just go and taste and see for yourself. And like to go to Burgundy and see the Côte d'Or and the slope, and you can see Mont Blanc off in the distance. It's quite a bit different than reading about it. So I would recommend travel. Yeah. And then after 16, I got a call from Margaret Harrison at Antica Terra. Andrew was leaving, her longtime assistant, the guy who had hired me, was leaving to start his own project, and she had asked if I wanted to come back as her assistant. And I loved my time at Screaming Eagle. I was having a great time learning a lot, but I realized, I kind of had to get out of my comfort zone. I had to kind of, continue to try something different and go somewhere else. And, it was the winemaker and the assistant, and those guys weren't going anywhere. They had a system down, so, I learned a lot from them, but it's like, as far as how my responsibility probably wasn't going to change a lot, and I needed to, continue to keep challenging myself, as one does in the industry, So I was happy to, and I wanted to come back from Oregon. I'm from Oregon. This is kind of home. It's where I started, and I loved working with Maggie in 2012, and so I came back. That was for the 17 vintage, and loved it. Lived in Amity, lived on the vineyard, worked with Maggie, and just loved it. Was there from 17, 18, and then 19. I stayed. In that time, I think it was maybe 18. Maggie, we were going to start, a small sparkling project, so she sent me over. I got to work briefly in Champagne at Domaine Jacques Lassen, which was amazing. He's a character. That's another, but just to go see there how they do things, not just the things they do, like the winemaking mechanics, but like the, kind of the attitude they have and their whole kind of cultural approach to it was fascinating. It was amazing, I have to say. That was the first, I had been to France before. I traveled there and spoke with winemakers, but that was the first time I had really seen the winemaking firsthand, and it was And I mean, most of it was me carrying bins, loading the press, doing this thing called the retrousse, where you dig up the press after you kind of bring it up. But seeing the big basket press in the middle of the cellar, like doing it in the old ways, was really cool, and really enjoyed that. Even though it was a very brief trip, but got to do that, and then spent 3 vintages at Antica Terra, and then in 19, I ended up moving back to California. Didn't have a job lined up, but when I first lived in California, I met a girl, and as these things happen, I ended up getting married, and she was a winemaker in Sonoma, so I ended up moving back to Napa, or to California, due to that reason. But again, didn't necessarily want to leave Antica Terra. Loved Oregon, loved the setup, but kind of just, life circumstances take you certain places, so, I felt I wanted to go, and then went back to California. And then, when I first got back there, I didn't really have a plan. I got into through contacts, I got into doing consulting, like being a consulting winemaker for a few small brands. One in Napa and one kind of in Sonoma and Napa, just through friends. And did that, made wine at custom crush facilities, which again was a huge learning process. Going from like, hey, I'm doing this pump over, I'm doing this addition, to, now you have to do work orders, write it all down, which in a way like helped me, because you have to be able to kind of clearly communicate your thoughts and your process and all these little things, because there's a lot of nuance in winemaking, and a lot of it, some of like, I don't know how long this pump over should be. How does the ferment smell? So a lot of it is by feel. So I had to kind of get used to that, which, if I'm being honest, it wasn't my greatest strength. I kind of prefer being the man on the ground doing it with my hands kind of in it. That being said, learned a lot, worked with great people, made very good wine. I hadn't really made a wine where it was just me, from picking decision to all the way to bottling and labeling, everything like that. So those were probably the first wines where I did that. And I have to give credit to the people that hired me and put their faith and kind of trust me. I was pleased with, by and large, with most of the results, but that, if I'm being honest, again, it wasn't where I thrived, kind of the consulting, and I also was doing, this was during COVID, and there was it was kind of a weird time in my life, and I also was selling corks. No, excuse me, not corks, barrels. I was selling barrels, which one of the things I love probably most about winemaking is working with barrels, oak selection, barreling down, prepping barrels. I respect wood, as it were. That's, if anyone who knows me knows that. It's I really like, so I enjoyed getting to kind of seeing the inner workings of that side of the industry. I got to go to France. It was Bel Air cooperage, great wood. I had used them and started using them in Napa, and used them with my own projects, and then sold them some to Washington. It was more probably a Bordeaux cooperage, but they certainly make some good white barrels and things like that. So really enjoyed that. Great team there. Ended up doing, it wasn't a great time. It was one of those things where people were kind of moving. New oak wasn't as in vogue as it once was, so people were kind of moving away from that more into a more delicate style, unoaked, which I can't say I agree with that particular trend, but each his own. And then it was slow. I was a representative for Oregon and Washington. They had a California rep who was awesome, had great relationships, but I just didn't, I'm not a salesman, I'll just say, I was not a good salesman. And there were some personal things happening, and I just did not do well. I ended up having to, I guess, got fired from that one, which completely understandable, and but nothing to reflect poorly on the company. Like great barrels, great people. I wish that hadn't happened, but again, it was an eye into that part of the industry, which I feel like the more exposure you can get to different things, working in a lab, selling oak, selling cork, selling glass, whatever that, working as a distributor or retailer, you see all the different facets. It's fascinating. And one of the things I did actually early in my career that I failed to mention is I got into the Master Wine Program. So, and that was, it's big tests you have to take, but you have to learn. And that's really, I started a tasting group here in Oregon with a bunch of people just working on a tasting room, and like different people I knew. And then we started tasting room just to get exposure to all the different wines and to help, share the costs. And, we had some great ones. It was great. And now, Andrew Riechers was in it, and Tracy from, what is it? Is she from Longolo?
Folly of Man.
Folly of Man. Tracy and Aaron were both in it. Thomas was in it. So it was just this group of like young kind of up and comers, and now to come back and see them all like, I mean, Thomas was like the president of IPNC. I'm like, oh, people have these, all my friends have ascended, like it's impressive. And to come back and work with Andrew, my current employer, Andrew Riechers of Andrew Riechers Wines. That's his plug. And he's, you know, doing all these different things, has his own labels, a head winemaker. I'm like, this, man, you've been thriving. I necessarily hadn't been thriving, but still enjoying myself. But I'd say, so I started tasting group in Oregon, had all these people and we were tasting, again, exposing ourselves to all manner of wines. Because I was in the MW program and trying to learn, you know, who drinks PX Sherry, you know, and or like Jura wine. So, but you know, you've got to go out, you've got to be at least familiar with them. So, you know, it's easy to get to know your Pinots and your Chardonnays, but you know, really to know the world of wine, you have to taste all things from all places. You have to drink your Pinotages from South Africa, and your Malbecs from Argentina, all the different stuff. So that was great. And then I kept that going in Napa. I was in part of a tasting group there, which it was probably more of a structure, more of a professional. It was like a specific MW tasting group. But I mean, at one point, there was a bunch of people coming out of that tasting group, like passing. We had MWs giving us tastings every weekend, because it was every weekend, and it was just like, the level was very high. And I mean, tasting's a tricky thing, you know, you can do a sensory class, but really to be able to like kind of articulate in your own language where you say it, but it also makes sense in your mind, that's kind of a hard gap to fill. You know, there's like what do they call that? Like a dissonance where you know, like I taste it, but I can't really describe it. So that was really pivotal in learning how to just talk about what I was tasting. And in broad strokes, you know, I don't really, you know, when people get these real specific descriptors, I don't know if I necessarily buy into that, but you know, just general kind of things that helped me, because I realized I don't have what do they call? I'm not a super taster. I don't have more taste buds, but you know, as long as you can kind of generally give the idea, I feel like that was useful, especially in winemaking, you know, sitting down and like being able to blend where, you know, the differences between 40 Cabernet samples is pretty slight, but you've got to be able to kind of pick them out and talk about them to a degree. You know, that really helped me. And that I think helped me kind of progress in the industry as well. So I was doing the MW program, learned a lot, never passed the test, not an MW. I mean, abject failure if I'm being honest. But, you know, the people I met, the learning I had, and I will say this, I don't know if any MWs, but I may not be done with the program. Maybe I might have to go back to it. You know, it is such a useful thing. And at this point, I probably don't need the credential, thank you, Rich. But it's almost like a personal thing. It's like I put a lot of time and effort into it. Like, I need this. So, or I want this too. So, and again, I made a lot of friends, wonderful people. They do their trips. It's a great organization. You know, it fit me more for, it was more kind of academic and technical than the Court of Master Sommeliers, which is also excellent. But, you know, I'd never worked at a restaurant. And once I did production, I wasn't going to. I did work in an Army dining facility, but there was no wine. So that was my extent of my time in the service industry. And so the MW program just was better for me. And so I would say that was pretty big in like just learning and getting to the point where I could be a winemaker, you know, because I didn't have any technical or any kind of official degree or anything like that. I did take some classes at Schmidt, which was also awesome. When I lived in Oregon, went down there and again met great people and learned a lot of good things. I wish I had actually been able to kind of go into that and do more classes, but I think I moved to Napa and just, you know, kind of it was hard to find the time. But again, a great program. Really learned a lot doing that and met great people. You know, that's, you know, if there's one unifying kind of theme is like the places I've been and the places I've worked, and there's just so many wonderful people and relationships. To this day, even if I haven't seen him, John, you know, from Torimo, I hadn't seen him probably in 10 years, and he reached out. He's like, hey, are you around? And then I ended up working with him again and catching up. And so things like that is, you know, something I really love about the industry. So, yeah, and then to go back to the timeline, after I had done some consulting, and those didn't really work out either. It just wasn't my strength. Even though the people were great, the wines were good, working with good vineyards, good growers. It was a really good setup, but it just wasn't something I thrived at. I was excelling at, and I, you know, probably had some personal things going on. And then ended up kind of entering into kind of my time in the wilderness, I'll call it. I kind of just started traveling a little bit. I ended up doing, that was in 23 and 24, no, excuse me, 22 and 23. I went to England. I had an intern in Antica Terra who was English, and I was kind of, nomadic at the time, and he reached out to him and said, hey man, do you need any help? He worked at a place called Chapel Down, and he didn't, but he knew a place, a very small place called Herbert Hall in Kent, and their winemaker was going on maternity leave, and they're like, look, they need someone with a little more experience, and it's a small place, and the people are wonderful, and went there. And again, just first time substantial amount of time I'd spent in England, and I loved it. And loved the people. I did that in 23, went back in 24, and would go back again. If I'm kind of projecting into the future, that's a place I'd love to go get involved. The owner and winemaker, Nick, he's kind of, we were, as soon as we met, we just got along and saw eye to eye in winemaking, and just a wonderful guy. And then his winemaker, Kirsty, who I was kind of replacing for that vintage, she was wonderful too, got along with her. But Nick's an older guy, and he's kind of looking to transition out, so I've been looking to both maybe get involved in that in some capacity, and maybe even bring the wines here. It's a very small project, but again, very high quality, and just loved it. So again, one of those situations where I met the people, and I'm like, man, I couldn't be luckier. How did I get so lucky to meet these kinds of people and make this great wine, and have great meals together, and just kind of wonderful experience altogether. So did that for 2 vintages, and then as we get back now to the more current time, Andrew Riechers, who I'd worked with at Antica Terra, he had called me and said, hey man, I hear you're in Oregon kind of floating. And I was like, I am. And so he asked if I wanted to come back and work for him. He's the winemaker at Audeant. He does, like I said, he has multiple labels, and he was making a facility, and he was going to do, I want to say close to 90 tons, which for one person is too much. I think he does he has had an intern in the past, or used the facilities where he was making the wine. He'd have interns from there help him, but he needed just someone, again, with a little more experience, could drive a forklift, kind of do the basic things, and I was happy to. It kind of worked out perfect. I was like, I'm not doing anything, and again, to get to work, that was 24, and then that was supposed to be just a harvest job. I ended up staying. We've had the best time. It's been wonderful. Working with, I'd say, going back, looking, just being able to work with people you like, go in every day, and it's really one of the important things, I would say. So getting to work with a friend, it was the same at Screaming, it was just me and 2 other buddies, making great wine, which was, one of the highlights of the career. And same working at Antica Terra, seeing, Maggie traveled a lot, and she wore a lot of different hats, but when she'd come in, it was always like, oh, get to see her, and the tasting room crew, those people who worked there when I was there, were still friends with them. And so, just kind of making these friendships and fostering them over the years is really one of the great things about the wine industry. I feel like, most people tell you don't necessarily get in. It's more of a lifestyle decision to get in, and relationships. So that's really been wonderful. And that kind of brings me up to now. Again, that job with Andrew turned into full-time. He's like, I need help. We got a bottle, we got a rack, we got to do various things. And he's continued to grow a little bit, and it's been great. And Andrew, he hired me in 2012, and when he reached out to me this time, I kind of consider him a peer. I was like, oh, of course I'll come work in the summer, help you out. And then, working with him again, I've realized, he's definitely developed way beyond me, and to hear, and I've learned things from every winemaker, everyone I've worked with, and to work with him again, to see how far he's come from where we were at in 2012. It's been great to see. And I'm learning a lot here too, and enjoying it. When we make good wine, you get to try some there, Rich, and I'm sure you've had it. But yeah, it's been great. And at the moment, still working with him, and probably gonna be there. We'll see. I'm probably at a point where I should try and, again, step into a winemaking role, take on a little more responsibility. But if I'm being honest, it's still kind of my time in the wilderness, although I'm looking to come in, maybe. We'll see.
You can see the edge of the forest.
I like to think so, and I think it's starting to feel like that again. So we'll just see. But yeah, that's where I'm at now, but enjoying it. And last year, I'm sure you've been told, 24 was an awesome vintage. It was great. I kind of thinking back when I first showed up in Oregon, I was 2010, but we just had '08. '08 was coming out, and that was considered one of the great vintages, you know. And so just kind of seeing these, I feel like 17 was a really good vintage. 18, I think, got a lot of, you know, and I got to work here. And the weird thing is, you know, I left Napa in 16, and then 17 is when they had all those terrible fires. And then I was here, so I didn't see that down there. And, you know, there were always fires, but I kind of missed that. Then I came up here, and then in 20, there was those, you know, terrible fires out by Forest Grove and stuff, and down in the Mackenzie, and I had also left for that. So I kind of missed those, but then being down in Napa, you know, it's been bad. It was bad in 20, 21, I don't remember, but, you know, there were some things where I have pictures, and it looks like it's a big mushroom cloud, which has been fascinating. And I feel like, you know, kind of seeing that, it was like I've been fortunate to avoid some of those worst years, but, you know, people find a way, they get through it. So that's been a real interesting kind of recent thing in the wine industry, kind of seeing that. And yeah, so that might inform the next move a little bit. That being said, I'm open to all things. I could go to California. You know, if something happened in England, if I win the sweepstakes, maybe I'll just buy my own thing. You know, the options, if I can quote, I've got nothing on my horizon except everything. And that's not to say I'm not, you know, happy making wine with Andrew and doing what we're doing. And there's growth there, and there's things happening. So, you know, that's kind of where I'm at.
It's quite a journey.
You know, yeah, it is. You know, I've never really given it all in that detail in some time, and, you know, to reflect back on, I get, you know, I get nostalgic about it, and it has been great. And again, the people and the place I've got to see, you know, because by and large, most wine producing regions are very, you know, they're beautiful places. So to get to go to travel these places and see, and the people who are into it, by and large, you know, they're very passionate. Like, it's that, again, the combination of kind of this artistic and scientific worlds that kind of come together, and so you see both sides, and to feel both sides of that is really, I feel like that's one of the fascinating things about it, one of the things I like about it.
So let's go back to even before you started making wine, when you were selling wine in Texas. Tell me about you. What intrigued you about wine enough to want to learn more about it? What intrigued you to want to become knowledgeable about the topic more than just a basic knowledge? What kept you going, and what did you find was interesting enough about wine to kind of keep propelling you forward?
Yeah, I mean, you know, because when I first started drinking wine, it was, you know, the most basic things, like Francis Sangria, it was really to just get drunk. You know, but then as, you know, this store, they had, like I said, they had a big international selection, and you get to try, you know, I feel like I'd maybe heard of German Riesling, but as you started to get to exposed to them, and then because of the strong basis in geography in wine, like, you know, Mosel versus, like, just for Germany, for example, like, oh, these wines have green glass because they're from the Mosel, and they taste like this and have this kind of sugar level and this kind of alcohol. So kind of the geography thing was something I was always fascinated, and history. As I mentioned, I studied history in college, and so I was always fascinated that to go back and to look at Burgundy and say, well, that's why these varieties kind of, you know, thrived, and while they were cultivated, and you know, the geography and the old Dukes of Burgundy and the you know, how things were developed there, and then to go back to Bordeaux, you know, someone told me, you know, they've had one chateau had, you know, they had their 500th vintage, and it's like the, you know, vintages that go beyond, you know, the age of our country. You know, it's just fascinating to see, and so that kind of aspect of history and geography, that, you know, that was the hook. And then I like to drink, and, you know, it was one of those things where you don't realize, you know, I was probably drinking for effect, you know, just like, you know, whatever was available. But when you start to taste things, you're like, oh wow, it's complex. There's a lot, you know, I can't necessarily describe it, but there's a lot happening here, and this is enjoyable. And I remember, you know, winemakers talk about their kind of epiphany bottles. Mm-hmm. And I remember it was one time I was working at that store, and I got a bonus for whatever reason. But I took it to a wine bar with my girlfriend at the time, who also worked there, and we got one of the bottles was Argyle Extended Tirage, Extraterrestrial, which again was, being from Oregon, I knew about it, and so I wanted to try it. And it was amazing, you know, to drink it, and it kind of it has this richness and this broadness, kind of this texture to it, but then it finishes with like great focus and precision and length, and like, so that combination of both like richness and focus was like, I was like, wow, never had anything like that. And then the other bottle we drank was it was called Bianchi Petit Syrah. It was from like the Central Coast, and again, it just had all these like this, like all these different flavors. There's like Tootsie Roll and dark fruit, and and it was just like, wow, there's a lot happening here, and it just kind of fascinated me. As I started learning about sensory science and like the chemistry behind it, and those 2 bottles and that occasion, I blew the whole bonus on that one wine bar. It was worth it. But it was great, and we both were kind of like, wow, that and that's kind of started to pique the interest. And I would say that bottle of Argyle, that sparkling wine, is really, I've been into, if I got to make, I'd want to make textured whites. Like wines kind of like, the 2 that come to my mind, one is the Lopez de Heredia Blanco, their white wine, Gravonia, and then the Jacques Solo Champagne, which I got to drink the Solo Champagne at Antica Terra. And again, had never heard of it, but it just tastes like nothing I had ever tasted. It was fascinating, but there was a lot happening, and I really liked it. And again, it had this kind of combination of richness and focus and purity that I really liked. And so those are if there were an asteroid speeding towards the Earth and we had 30 minutes and 1 bottle to drink, it'd probably be Solo Substance if I had to. Not that I have it, but that's what I would drink, because it fascinated me. So those kind of bottles just open, took it from, I'm just drinking to unwind, have a drink, whatever, to like, oh wow, this and then it got to be, I'm opening bottles and, I maybe studied about Code Roti, but you don't actually know. Then you're like, oh wow, this is, the black pepper and the, all the kind of classic characteristics, or like Australian Riesling, like the petrol and the lemon zest and things. You're like, oh, I see it. And so then that just kind of snowballed into, learning more and then trying more things, and and then the MW program, getting exposure to like things that I just never would have tasted otherwise, and the range of flavors is, I think they say there's the number of compounds in wine it's well over 2,000 or 3,000, but I think the closest thing is coffee, which has maybe 500 to 800. So just the amount of things happening is, and then when you start to taste that and kind of see it in sensory terms, you're like, oh wow. So that's kind of what, and it was a slow progression at the store. Like they'd open 1 bottle a week for employees just to help us sell, but then all of a sudden you're like, oh wow, this Mosel Riesling, it tastes like apple juice, and it's like this, it's lower alcohol and it's kind of sweet. They're like, this is great. So, and then it'd be a red Burgundy where you'd be like, wow, I didn't think, wine could have this kind of range of flavors and things like that. So
tell me a little bit about your first harvest. You touched on it at 12th and Maple. What was the experience like? What were you doing, and what was exciting enough about the work that made you want to keep doing it?
Yeah, so that was 2010, and we were, I got the job because I had no cellar experience, so I was like, man, I'll just take what I can get. And I think I forget the guy's name. His name was Michael. He was one of the winemakers there. He interviewed me. He's like, and he had seen that I was in the Army, so he's like, so you can probably deal with, physical work and kind of colder and harder conditions, and I was enthusiastic. So, and I think they were at the point, they had I think even then we might have had 10 interns. So it was a bigger production. And so we came in, and it was a good mix of people with experience and like newcomers like me. So, and that was great. And it was mostly Pinot Noir. 2010 was a cooler vintage, a wet vintage. So there was some challenges. You did have to make the wine. And, there was, because they do a little larger production, like you kind of had to know some of the tricks and some of the, things you can do to kind of mitigate botrytis and powdery mildew and things like that. And in some instances, things were underripe. The rain was starting to move in. I remember the head winemaker came in. I think his name was Aaron. I forget his last name. But he came in and he seemed kind of stressed out. He's like, this is going to be, I could tell, he just kind of intimated it was going to be a challenging vintage. Which as an intern, I don't know any difference. It's not going to be that bad. But, I like the hard work. And then I remember, it was towards the end of harvest, and we did this cap management. It's called pulsing, where you shoot from the bottom of the tank with either nitrogen or compressed air. It has these ports. You plug in air and you kind of rock the cap to kind of turn it over. It's a very gentle extraction method that I think ERATH likes to do, and they did it at 12th and Maple. So we did more of that than pump overs or punch downs, to be honest. But I was doing that. So you do that, and then you have to go up the catwalk, and these are big. Probably 10-ton tanks or bigger. You had to go up the catwalk and then clean up the top, and you could really just kind of whatever. But like I realized, like, it's kind of that old trope, if how you do anything is how you do everything. So it's like I really kind of embrace, and one of the winemakers there, Chris Baker, kind of talked about, like he's like, man, it's all these 1,000 little things. Like you do all of these little things right. There's no, I mean, sure, the pick date's important, and your fermentation temperature and your yeast and all that, those things matter, but like it's those 1,000 little things that show you care. Like in food, like a chef that really cares, like it comes across, you see that. So, and he also said kind of like, look guys, your name is not going to be on this, none of you guys are the winemaker, but there is a part of you in this. And like wherever you work, there's going to be a little part of you. You can say, I remember seeing, I think that wine, it was Erath, it was like Erath Oregon Pinot in 2010. And I didn't say I made that wine, but I was like, I had to stop myself. I think I saw it later on, years there, but I was like, I was there for that to a small degree. But there's just that sense of pride. And I remember thinking that, making it, I'm like, and I thought that was great. It's like, this is, so that really kind of informed how I approached it. It's like, and if you're going to do something, you might as well do it well. This is a luxury product. Like, if all the wine were gone, like, we're not doctors here. We're not, doing anything life-saving. But it's still, that's not to say it's not important and can be your life's work, and that you shouldn't really take pride and do a good effort, a good job in it. So that's. I kind of, all those things kind of coalesced for me in that first harvest, even though it was, it was bigger production and we weren't necessarily the small artisanal, but like they were still making things technically and if mistakes were made, like they were on it and they're like, no, hey guys, we don't, no, that's not how it goes. Like, and you have to clean this, and if you don't clean a forgotten area on a tank or on the auger or something, like this could, not that it would, but it could, it could have consequences down the road. So you wanted to make sure that everything was kind of done to the best that you could. Mm-hmm. And I like that, and I kind of, and again, the shared hardship, the solidarity, the long, I liked all that, the physical nature, coming through it at the end, and then like, having the harvest party is always a good time, and drinking wine, and I'm sure, a lot of winemakers say that after harvest is kind of like this post-harvest lull, this almost a depression where you're like, kind of like, well, what the fuck am I supposed to do now? Join the Peace Corps. It's like you had this purpose, and you're making wine, and all your time, and then all of a sudden it's like, well, it's over, and that's, it's an adjustment, not the hardest. But we didn't have that this year because we decided to bottle in December, which I'm very thankful for, because it kept okay. We've got something to work towards. We've got the focus, and so that's that was good for this vintage.
On that note, you talked earlier about kind of the classic thing for a lot of young winemakers. You do a lot of harvests, but it's a long time until you see the other parts of the year, until you see the quieter parts of the year. So tell me about the first couple of times sort of seeing the quiet season. How long did it take you to find kind of the enjoyment in the not harvest part of the year?
Yeah, I mean, it really, so first vintage was 2010, and then I didn't get full-time cellar work until 2014, really. It was following the 13 vintage. And at that point, you were kind of like, I'll take any. I would get to help out with bottling sometimes at Torrymore or at Antica Terra. They're like, hey, we need help cleaning barrels. We need help on bottling. And so, you jump at those, because I knew from early on I wanted to do production. That's where I liked, and that's what I wanted. But there's not a lot of jobs. At the time, you had a bunch of interns, but all those interns are kind of fighting for these very select, very few full-time harvest jobs. And you have to be good, and you have to have some experience, and it's hard to get it if you try to set yourself apart during harvest, working hard. But again, I didn't know the difference between an impeller pump and a rotary load pump and an air pump, and so they're going to take guys who have more experience. That being said, I jumped at any opportunity to blend, to do anything. So I had done that, and then in 13 I worked in the lab at 12th and Maple, and I think most of the interns, we had fewer interns that year, and a lot of people were leaving, and so I was lucky. They're like, look, Trevor, you can stay, and go, but you're gonna have to go to cellar. You can't stay in the lab. And I was like, hey, that's okay. And if I'm being honest, 12th and Maple, there isn't really a slow time. I mean, we're bottling for a month in February at Pinot Gris, so it's like getting those wines finished and done and prepped for bottling is a lot, and I love that. And it's like, we're setting the wines up, we're putting them on oak. We got to, that was one of the places where I really saw kind of on a larger scale, like there wasn't as much. And then in the summer, it's 3 months of bottling, which, in a smaller place, you're probably going, that's where you're more starting to do your vineyard monitoring and starting to take a look. And, I didn't get as much into the vineyard till later on, working at smaller places, which again, that's the seasonal nature of winemaking is great. I had a friend, the winemaker Screaming Eagle, he had started in beer and he loved it, but beer is harvest every day. Like he loved the kind of seasonal nature, the ebbs and flows of grape growing and winemaking. I think that has a lot of appeal. And it did to me too, because there are those natural times when you can it's slower now, or it's more it's game time, kind of, harvest and things like that. So, so doing that at 12th and Maple, that was my first experience with full-time cellar work, and it was hard and it was involved, but it was great. And I was learning a lot, and I was working with a very good team. I had a really good teacher. Everyone, I think I was probably the least experienced guy in the cellar, but I was enthusiastic, and they appreciated that. So, and just getting to see that and ask a lot of questions, and it's Oregon, and this time of year it's cold and it's dark, and the cellars aren't warm, but I do enjoy. I just enjoy the work. So even now working, I'm even despite my experience, I'm a cellar hand for Andrew essentially. So but that grunt work, the boots on the ground, I like that kind of. I've always liked that work, and so, and I feel like as a winemaker, you want to always stay in touch with that. Like one of the things when I was consulting, I didn't get as much hands-on. Like I didn't get to touch and feel and smell and get all involved, and that was harder for me. And I feel like you always need to, no matter how large a scale, you always have to be down on the ground with, with your ferments and be very involved physically and physically close. And I feel like that's an important thing to do.
So you worked at Screaming Eagle, you worked at Antica Terra, two places with pretty high reputations, pretty high costs. Tell me about, is there a pressure that comes with that? Did you feel differently working at a place like that, where the expectation is that high?
I didn't. I feel like the winemakers and maybe the powers that be, there was some pressure, and but there was, because again, back to 12th and Maple, I decided that first when I was wiping down, I was like, no, I'm going to do this right. I'm going to do this right. You do it right every time. And then so kind of carrying that attitude, I guess that's not, you have to have that attitude working at those places. And I like to think that's part of the reason I probably got to work there, is they realize, you got to do everything, and it's like, and it really, again, those 1,000 little things. It's not like anyone. It's how you treat every little thing, And one thing I learned, it's the way that there's many different ways, and there's no right way per se. It's like, but at Antica Terra, Maggie would always, iterate this is what feels good to me. This is what feels right. There's a feel behind it. There's a touch. I don't like to do that. Why? Well, it just doesn't feel, and I really respect that. I heard Anne-Claude Leflevre speak one time this is before she passed, right before, and she wasn't a technical winemaker. But I remember her saying she brought in either a string quartet or some singers, because she had some sluggish ferments at the end of harvest, and she's like, and it worked. And they finished, I was like, I don't know, but just kind of that feel and that sense of we're going to put everything in it, and that just felt right. And maybe, in talking to your bear, those things which, the intangibles, you can't understand, because there's so much about wine we don't understand. All wine is pretty much, it's alcohol, water, acid, tannin. The difference that separates, Grand Cru Burgundy from, box wine is less than 1%, right? All those little things that we don't necessarily can't quantify. So, but that little bit, that's where all the effort from picking a place to growing to making, that's where all that kind of comes in. And so you've got to do that. But to answer your question, Rich, I didn't feel a lot of pressure, but I liked it too. And also, those places, they know what they're doing. They have their systems. You do it like this. There's no shortcuts. And if you do it like that, you'll be fine. And so, and sometimes when you do it like that, it doesn't necessarily turn out how you want to, but again, that's part of the kind of the unknowns and the intangibles working with wine. It's like, why does this barrel and this barrel from the same lot, the same fermenter, a foot apart in the cellar, taste so different and they're both in neutral barrels, and yet they're so different in ways that what's going on here? So sometimes it just can't be helped, but everything that can be helped, places like that, they certainly do. There are systems, and and there's, even more so than systems, there's a philosophy and there's a culture that comes from the winemaker, and they're just you see them do things, you see them show you how they want it done, and that's how you do it, And even working with Andrew or working with Mag, be things like, well, I would do it like this, I'll do it differently, but you know, this is their wine and their vision, so I'm happy to do it. And I may not always understand why they're doing it that way, but you know, that's not my decision to make. And so in a way that kind of takes a little of the responsibility. You know, when I was consulting, like, there'd be times where I'd be like, well, I want it like this, but I want it like this, but if it does this, you have to do this, and it would be very hard to explain. And they're just like, I'm just gonna pump it over, and I'm like, just step aside. But I couldn't do that because you can't touch the equipment and all this, you know, so, but it's, like, again, it's very nuanced and subtle, and you're like, you know what, it just needs, you know, some things, and sometimes you can't always explain that. Such are the unknowable ways of fine wine, love, life, you know, to wax philosophical, so. Which is, you know, again, wine has a lot of that aspect, which makes it what it is.
Talk about you mentioned your time in Champagne, though brief, being kind of transformative for me. Tell me a little bit more about your time there and about sort of maybe some of the things you saw, some of the things you learned, some of the things that kind of changed your mind about wine. My
first time working in Europe, it was with Emmanuelson, which is, you know, one of the kind of an iconic grower champagne now. And it started, it was, his name is Emmanuel Lecen, is the winemaker. His father, Jacques Lecen, started it. And his father is this, it's fascinating in every way. It's in this small village called Mongu, which is outside of Troyes, which is, you know, it's kind of away from the main part of Champagne and from Epernay and Reims and all that. So it's kind of an outlying region. And the way he does things, like, you know, his father probably did things pretty traditionally, and then Emmanuel was the oldest son. He had went away, and he had actually not been getting into, wasn't going to get into wine, but his younger brother was. And I think Emmanuel eventually came to realize he wanted to, and he came back and started working it and took over the domain. But I mean, this is a place where, you know, they have their plots of land, and like, they just know like the day. And you know, it's very, talk about doing it by feel. Like, they just kind of know, like, oh, on this day, you know, part of it, you know, I think the picking is kind of dictated by the government organization. Like, you can pick between a certain window. And so, but like, they just had a feel. It's like, oh yeah, we'll pick this in 2 days. And it was a very kind of, I don't want to say it was a casual approach, but just, you know, when you worked in a place that has that many vintages, and I don't know how it goes back. I mean, everything from the way the you know, the training system, the trellising, the grapes, they have such a feel for it. They're so in tune with it. You know, he did it, his dad did it, probably his grandfather. They're so in touch with it. And so a lot of it's just by tasting it, and they just kind of know there's this kind of innate understanding. And then, you know, the way they make it, oddly enough, is pretty. It's actually kind of formulaic. Like, it comes in, you press it, like your different levels of like, it's just volumetric. So like, you know, the free run is a certain amount, and then the tie, the first time, the premier and the deuxième tie, you know, those are just volumetric. It's nothing based on doing tasting or press cuts or anything. It's all kind of legally mandated and set aside, and yet it seems to, you know, they get the juice and it goes to the cellar, and it seems to, you know, they put some in. He does some different things. He puts, you know, some in oak and some in steel, but he also had wine going in like berries of Jurançon, like fortified wine or a certain kind of wine from the Jura. He'd age it in there with that lees, and it just completely, you know, maverick, never kind of done or considered. And he had some wines that he had put into barrels that had Fino Sherry in there, and just all these kind of different approaches. And you're like, wow, there's such this traditional traditional way they do things, and yet he's doing these things that no one had ever, you know, even considered really. So that was fascinating to see. And you know, during peak fermentation, there you couldn't go in the cellar because there was no oxygen. So clearly there's like no ocean. Like, they're just like, it's fermenting. It's like, there's just, and I mean, you know, granted their pHs are lower, there's higher acids. You don't have to worry about certain spoilage things, but they just don't. I mean, it doesn't seem to even be a consideration for them. You know, and there's kind of, again, this innate understanding. They have a feel for it. And I'd always ask him, like, oh man, what do you think? Is that going to be? And he's just always like, we'll find out. We'll find out. Like, this happened, and, you know, we'll find out. And I'm, you know, so it's partially kind of this acceptance of, you know, we're farmers, we get what we get, and then also, like, we guide it in the way we can. If we're doing it right, great. If not, well, oh, we missed that one. We've also, you know, maybe my kids will figure it out or something like that, you know. And it echoed, I'd heard a winemaker. He was from a bigger French company. They started planting vineyards in China, you know, and they're like, you know, it takes 80 to 100 years to even get to know a vineyard. I was just like, well, considering how young our industry is. But that's just kind of the view they take of it, And it was a fascinating area too, Rich, because also like his nephews, he did a great job of, Mongo was kind of a lesser known village, of handing out his t-shirts and kind of putting it on the map. And like all his, he's a lot of family in the village, he's handed out the t-shirts. I mean, I think I had 6 from one vintage t-shirts that I brought home with me, just because he'd be like, "Can you get a t-shirt?" and he'd just throw me one. And then he makes a little bit of red wine. He made some Pinot for his dad, who just likes to drink red wine and would never think of buying it, because it's like, what, and then, but he had family and nephews who drove the tractors and did a lot of the picking. And these guys, a lot of them, it's like, they all were like motocross, like motorcycle racers and it was kind of like automobile sports were very big there. They'd close the streets outside the Trois on the weekends, and there'd be like rally car races and stuff. So this combination of kind of rural, dare I say redneck kind of culture with like fine wine. And you would see it, and it's not something I expected in the slightest. And it was very interesting. And then just the history, right? You go into Trois, and we're walking through the village, and they're making, there's spirits they have, and then he points out the building that he's like, oh, that was the headquarters of the Nazis. And it still has pockmarks from bullet holes, and I was just like that. And as a history student, again, I was like, that's amazing. You could plaster, but it's never a thought, and to see things like that. And there's one vineyard, I forget the name of it. It's the only walled vineyard in the village, and it's because in World War II, that's where the Americans set up. They built a wall. Everything else is just open space, and he's like, this village is walled because this is where the Americans set up before they retook the city of Troyes. So just hearing things like that and relating it to it's fascinating. It's cool. It's very cool. So, yeah. But then again, just going and be like, bringing that kind of mindset back, be like, let's get a feel. Like, we might not hit the home run on the first pitch, and that's okay. Like, let's get a feel. You taste, because you see, especially with sparkling wine, the chemistries have to be a certain way. You can't have too high a bricks, and you have to have acids at a certain time. But if the flavor's not there, you're not going to make a great wine. So that's one of the things over there. It's like, and to their credit, like, those wines are physiologically ripe at the perfect chemistry. It's like, you motherfucker. Like, they just have, I got to visit Armand Rousseau, and we were tasting wines right out of barrel from the previous vintage. I'm like, this is very good. They're not doing anything. It's like they just have. It's like, you motherfuckers. Like, this shit is so good. Why don't you just you get a little jealous because you work so hard, and granted, we're still learning here and everything, but like, they've just been doing it for such a long time and have such a feel for it. So seeing that kind of thing, but it's like, man, they know because again, the history, and to see that and kind of trust that a little. They have that provenance where they can, like, hey, we know where the ebbs and flows, the tides of history are taking us, and they just kind of are at ease with that. Whereas here, we're younger. We're, as an industry, trying to fine tune it and figure it out quickly, and we're making great progress. But it's still, we don't have that history. So, but being able to just think, okay, it's okay if we don't get it right this time, all in good time, and I believe that. So.
And you also talk about making wine in England, of course, a lesser known wine region with a little bit different history. So tell me a little bit about that and about why it was so intriguing to you.
It wasn't intriguing at first until I got there. I was like, oh, I'll go England. As a country, I just liked it. But to get there, to see it, how it's evolved, it's fascinating. And you're starting to see more like still wine, and part of it is due to climate change. Like, there's places where they couldn't grow for, and they still, like, when I did my vintage in Champagne, we were done by September 1st. Everything picked and pressed out by September 1st. We didn't start picking in England, I think, till October 6th. So, it was just, and this is Chardonnay, Pinot Meunier, your classic things in southern England too. So, and England's geography and climate are so different, because some of the warmer, better places for Pinot Noir were like, I think they were northwest of London, and then I think one of the oldest wineries was southwest towards Cornwall, which is one of the wettest, coldest places. So kind of how they've laid it out, they're still figuring it out, and it's still the kind of place where it's like 1 in 3 vintages, it's slop trough. Like, this is rotten, we can't get it right, even with all the tricks. It's very hard. So they're still on the edge there, and I think viticulture wise, they're still. But as far as technical sparkling winemaking, they are really. I mean, that's what they teach. But like, they brought me in, they're like, Trev, we need some Pinot Noir to put in our rosé. I'm like, this isn't complicated, guys. Like, you put, they're like, we need you to do this. You've made red wine. I'm like, I feel like sparkling wine, not that that's why they brought me over, but they certainly felt more comfortable just having someone who had made red wine. But sparkling wine, there's more probably wine making involved, right? You have your initial fermentation and then blending in, because the effervescence, it kind of exacerbates everything, good or bad. Like if you put too much sulfur, those bubbles it's gonna hurt you. Or if there's a little bit of VA, they're much more noticeable in sparkling. So you have to be much more precise, and there's more steps, there's more technical steps involved. And so I'm like, if you're doing this, fine. Like, this is not, it's a simpler process. So, but they appreciated having that. I'm like, it was maybe 1/2 ton fermenter of red wine, just enough to blend in for the rosés, for the sparkling rosé. Their new red wine making, that kind of thing, is probably something where most winemakers, like here, red wine is, everyone makes red wine, whereas there they don't quite have the experience with it. Although that being said, most winemakers there have gone out and they've worked in France, and the woman I worked with, Kirsten, she had done a vintage at William Sellium. So, they certainly know to get out and get that experience, and France is right there. But there's definitely places that are making as good a sparkling wine as anywhere, maybe outside of Champagne. I still feel like the Champenois do it to a level that's just probably the top of the heap, but England's right there, and they have like the natural climate, like they can get that long, hang time where like they don't have to pick the fruit early because it's getting too much sugar or anything like that. And then culturally, I just realized it was a good fit. I love Tweed. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. I feel like ever since I read Hound of the Baskervilles, I just loved it. The drinking culture. If you open a cider at 9 o'clock in the morning, no one looks askance. It's just like, oh, good morning to you. And I literally lived in a 5-bedroom farmhouse on the vineyard in a little village in the countryside. The local pub was called the Unicorn. It just, you walk into town and have a few drinks, and I bought a tweed jacket. I just had to do it. So all of those things, I really enjoyed it. And you see the history of it. I enjoyed it. And the ease of transportation with the trains and stuff. I had a friend tell me, oh, you got to get a car and you got to do all these things, but it was very simple, and everyone's very polite to your face, at least. They also like to give Americans a hard time, but that didn't bother me in the slightest. I kind of respect that old school decorum and manners, and the insults even they're not too bad. So. Which is nice. I liked it.
That's the accent.
It is. It certainly sounds a certain way. It just comes up like, did he just, And I first got exposed to that in the MW program, where they'd say things, I'm like, he just called us all stupid. And I was like, well, it didn't sound like it. No, it didn't sound like it. And then they, words like Rioja, it's like no one says it like that, not even people in Spain. So, but they say it and they think they're right, and there's a charm to that. I don't know. I like it. I would go back in a heartbeat, so. And again, England, I have to, a lot of the MW programs starting, and several of us students have had to remind you people for the longest time did not make good wine. So that being said, because they didn't, it was probably the most mature wine market in the world. Like you go down to, you go to Hedonism Wine, and there's a wall of Echem, and there's a wall of Screaming Eagle, and you're just like, oh my God. So they have, the wines you can get there, everything from anywhere is really cool. Like, they had Uruguayan wine and Chinese wine, and so that was one of the real cool things about England, like, because they do now, they make some good wine, and, but for the longest time, they did not. But they're prolific drinkers, as we all know. Some of the greatest cellars in the world come from them, that Sotheby, found and have been in these old English castles. So the range of wines they've had and the age of back vintage Bordeaux and things like that, it's incredible. So it's really cool to see things like that. Old South African wines that we just you don't even see here, that it's quite, you can get them there at a lot of places. So I'm a fan.
Talk about your current work a little bit. Obviously, working with Andrew and his various projects. Tell me about kind of what's the exciting part for you? What are you enjoying right now about your work, and what are the kind of some of the various projects you're working on?
Okay, yeah. So Andrew, we make Pinot and Chardonnay for Audeant and a rosé. So that's kind of the classic things, and those are just excellent. Andrew works with some of the best Pinot vineyards. Going back, ones that I've worked with too that I'm familiar with. Cherry Grove and Nisa, and their estate vineyard is just starting to show kind of its true colors, and that's exciting, just to make classic great Pinot. And Andrew does it well. He does it as well as anyone. And then he's got a project with his friend John Suarez called Sacred Shore. They make the Albarino. I call them the Albarino Kings of Oregon. Self-named. But and then we make Mencia and Sangiovese, and they made some Chenin Blanc. And it's like, we were just tasting the Sangiovese and Mencia yesterday. I was like, man, 5 years ago, if you'd asked me if I ever want to make Oregon Sangiovese, I would have been like, no way. But it's one of my favorite wines, and I love the Mencia they do is great. So working with different varieties is really cool. And then this year we took over the winemaking for Archer. They have some Pinot Gris and some Chardonnay, Pinot Noir just from their estate. And again, Andrew and I made Pinot Gris. I was in the winemaking process with Pinot Gris at both 12th and Maple and Tory Moore, but I'd never really got to talk with Andrew, and he hadn't either. We're like, Pinot Gris is Oregon's white varietal. Has been. You're probably transitioning a little to Chardonnay now, but we're like, we got to do this, man. And so getting to kind of figure out, I think we talked to a few people, like, what's the play? How do we press? And so getting to do that was, again, something where it was just us. And it's literally just him and I being like, what should we do here, man? I don't know. What do you think we should do? And so it's a friend, and so there's an open exchange of ideas. We have a lot of the same winemaking background. He spent some time in California, Santa Barbara, and so doing with these things. And Andrew, he has a very good sense of feel. He's like, we'll go down and taste, we're going to rack these things, or maybe we don't need to rack them. And I think, he's learning too, like, when you think of winemakers who've made, Sangiovese, that's all they've made. That's, just another day at the office. But for us, it's like, okay, you got to make sure you manage the acid, and you have to make sure with Mencia, you have to manage the tannin, and you don't. You might not even need to do one pump over a day and less time on skins, and just getting a feel for that. It's like going back to England where they're like, oh, red wine. I'm like, if you don't work with it every day, I can see how it might be a little daunting. So they kind of. And we're kind of, so we're learning together as we go through it. And just from the first vintage I tasted, the improvements have been noticeable, and it's been great. So I'm working with those different things, and then just seeing how Andrew's kind of evolved from when we worked together at Antica Terra, and we were both kind of just, doing, following the Antica Terra method, and then we get to work with him now. And so many things are the same, but so much has changed, and getting to see kind of his thought process. And one of the things I really enjoyed, we had some people come taste with us from like Literai and from Christum and a bunch of and the guy from Sea Smoke, they came up. And so I got to kind of hear, because I talk with him every day, but hearing him kind of articulate his approach, his philosophy, his methods to these guys who are top of the game, and I was like, wow, man, like, it's really smart. And it was really good. And I was learning a lot just listening, because I wasn't even going to taste them. I was going to just do my work. But he's like, no, man, come on. Like, don't leave me alone here. So I was happy, but I just listening to him and talk about it and the reasons for doing things, And again, reasons are, you don't know if they're right, but if it just feels right, or if it's just, or sometimes there is a very good reason, And so and it's different from every winemaker. Like, there's all these subtle little things, and I'm always learning that, and just to. One of the best things you can do is just go out and taste with winemakers, and and I like to ask questions, and like, why do you do that? Why, just be curious about it, because everyone's doing, we're all making wine, but there's slight variations, and like the littlest thing, I remember talking to Josh Bergstrom, and he's got his Lee Solera, his white wine Lee Solera, and I remember him saying, it's in a keg, and the amount of sulfur he has, and he's got to pull, when he's adding it. When he first takes the lid off, there's like this little wine on top, and he's like, and you pull that off and taste it, and it's just amazing. And that kind of thing, I'm like, oh wow, that's, a lot of people work with these, but to have that kind of system, I hope I'm not giving it away, Josh, but that was really cool. And I'm like, man, if you could, adding, and like I said, I'm into textured whites, so that kind of mouthfeel and how that translates and how he does that. I'm like, what a, it's a simple thing, but I'm like, that's That's fascinating. And some of the things Maggie does that no one does. But again, she feels right doing it. Some of the results she gets are out of this world. So, that kind of thing. And just, again, the more exposure and going to places is great. And I love learning these things. I have to say, one of the things being, just being a learner constantly. Like, you never know everything. Because vintage 26, we've worked with the same vineyards and the blocks and the varietals, but man, this vintage and this block and this, no one ever, it's a completely new set of parameters. So you gotta, every contest calls forth its own strategy. Sometimes you thrust, sometimes you parry, but you've got to, it's by feel. So I really like that, and it's a constant learning process. So
speaking of that, let's look ahead a little bit for you. Tell me about what haven't you done yet that you need to do? What's on your kind of winemaking bucket list?
Oh, good question. Really just to grow and make my own. I haven't done that. I kind of did it, as a consultant in Napa. But again, it was like the owner, they were knowledgeable wine people, and they had a vision for their style. So, I never got where I just had complete creative control. And so that's something that every winemaker you must at some point do this, to be completely fulfilled. And I haven't. And part of it is there's financial limitations, like buying fruit and all that kind of thing, so that's been, that's obviously probably the biggest thing. And I don't know if I want to make it in a commercial sense where I have to sell it to put food on the table. I never want that to be the thing. Or if no one buys it, I'll just give it to friends or drink it myself. But again, that's a hard place to be in. I mean, it's a business. If it's your life's work, you've got to see some return on that. So, that's probably the biggest one. I've never planted a vineyard, and I've heard, and that's been something I feel like if you're gonna, you've got to find a place and kind of make it your own, and really, thinking about the posterity going into the future, like to leave something like for whoever, just to kind of do that kind of thing and do it in the right way, and again, maybe in 100 years, you're like, this is the worst place to plant, whatever, you were wrong, or you planted the wrong, scion or brute stock or whatever, and you might not learn that, but you still, I think there's something to be said for just doing it, going forward, and just even if it's just for me to learn myself. So, those are two of the biggest things. Beyond that, on the wine bucket list, there's some places I haven't been. Obviously, I'd love to. I did my small vintage in Champagne, but I'd love to go. There's some places that even if I'm just a picker, like Salos and Lopez de Heredia, and I've got to visit these places, but to go and to do that would be something. Just in the small stuff, just to rub up against and say, hey, the 2030. Salos or whatever, they don't even do a lot of vintage things, but just to be involved and see, and again get their kind of their sense and their feel and how they approach things. Like that's what I've really, every winemaker I've worked with, there's the technical side, and then there's they're kind of, by what philosophy does their mind embrace their trade? I'm always fascinated by that, and normally it comes out in small ways. Just hear them talk about it, And that I really like hearing that from everyone. I've gone to Woodbridge Winery in Lodi, where they're making Mondavi Woodbridge, which is a huge production. But I mean, to hear that winemaker talk, he waxed philosophical in a way that I'd never heard. And he's tasting 70 Chardonnay samples a day just to get a feel. And then he's talking about his customers and what they want to see and how he has to do it and the range of fruit. I'm like, man, that is a job I can't even fathom. I mean, he's a winemaker, I'm a winemaker, but I could not do that. But again, what he's thinking about going through it is like, there's still a lot of consideration for who he's making it for and how it wants to end up, and I really respected it for it. And it's good to be exposed. We all want to be the Screaming Eagle, Antica Terra, John Thomas, these small, Vega Sicilia, whatever. But like, man, the guys doing it at that level, it's you need to see that and be exposed and respect what they do, because it's a different world, but there's no less care, there's no less thought or effort put into it too. So,
You talked a couple times about how you've seen sort of Andrew grow up as a winemaker. I'm curious about kind of extrapolating out from that. Tell me about Oregon and what you've seen kind of in the Oregon industry from the people the wines you're familiar with, the wines you've worked with. How has the industry grown in the time you've sort of been around it and aware of it, and what does the Oregon wine industry look like now in 2026? Yeah,
I mean exponential growth, right? Like I remember coming back when I first came up here in 2009, I think, to taste. It was the classics. It was Bergstrom and Adelsheim and Chehalem and Rex Hill and places like that. And now I drive around. There's just so many places. Like I don't even know what these places are. And there's a lot of people who I hear friends talk about. I'm like, I've never heard of them or tried those wines, or So the growth has been. You might even say the growth has been a lot. It might even be excessive, a little overgrowth, you might say. And that's all part of it, right? If you look at France, like the production, like when I was visiting the Rhone Valley, they pointed apart and they're like, that was before the World War II, that was a appellation over there. Now it's not. And now some guys it's kind of expands and contracts based on, the circumstances of the world and the market and all that. And Oregon's kind of finding its way. We had that growth, and I think the early people, and it was great to come here and Cal Erath had a bar in Newburgh, and Josh Bergstrom did the tastings, and you saw the originals or just one off of the originals. You're like, wow. It was kind of, when I first started, that was you kind of in awe. These are people, your heroes who started all, and now to kind of see the next generation coming up, and a lot of the next generation is people I know, like friends and peers. That's been pretty awesome to see. And then I feel like we're kind of we maybe there was a little too rapid of expansion, and now we're kind of equalizing, And it's funny, when I was in, we were kind of the post after the chefs, winemakers. It was the celebrity winemaker. Winemaking was cool, and everyone wanted. And the quartermaster sommeliers, I think, had those movies. What were they called?
Somm.
And wine, that was cool. It was rock star. And now it's it's hard to get interns sometimes. There's not the interns there once was. And I don't know if the market supports all of the growth we've had. I just talked to a few people from Napa, and not that I know specifically. I can't say I read a lot of the news, but they're having some problems. Constellation selling off their wine portfolio and all these things. So I think this dry January nonsense, I hope you guys don't partake in that. I certainly don't. But it's funny just seeing on the dating apps how many non-drinkers there are. They give you, it's wow, that wasn't, it's kind of a new temperance thing. So there are some challenges, not to mention the commercial things, the tariffs, and all the price of things and everything like that. There's a lot to consider. I feel I hope that with AI coming in, there'll be some efficiencies found. I love to think of ETS and some of these wine critics, Venice or something, getting together and putting all this data together and coming up with some pretty interesting, finding some patterns and some interesting things from that, and some, just some data sets of, maybe shows us some broad trends over time with that amount of data, especially with, not just ETS, but core and enologics. And my enologists down in California, if they could collate all this info and feed it through some kind of AI, and do that with some of the tasting notes from critics, just getting that kind of, cloud view of the industry, that would be something that I think, going forward, that, something to kind of look forward to, I feel like. So that being said, I feel like the wine industry is always a little behind in the technology fronts. I don't know if you guys feel that, from what I've heard, and I think that is, we kind of tend to be more, analog, old-fashioned, Luddites, and that's okay. If you look at Burgundy and some of the traditional, they've done things in a way that it works, so why change it? But, it's also very important to always kind of be looking and trying, and that's one big thing. That's one big thing, Rich, I'd say, is the growth out of just Pinot, Chardonnay, Pinot Gris, right? The amount of the different varieties being grown, and things people are trying, not just in the Willamette Valley, but out in Hood River. Nate Reddy at Hayu, what that madman is, he's just this mad scientist out there doing all sorts of crazy things. It's fascinating. I got to work with him at Antica Terra, and to see him kind of let his mind kind of go and try things that are, again, no one's trying them. It's just, it's a good thing for the industry. And the same down in Southern Oregon. Can't say I've been down there tasting as much, but there's big growth down there. I think there's a lot of potential kind of east of the I-5 corridor as you go south. There's some fascinating areas down there that, and there's some pretty old vineyards down there too. So, kind of exploring that area. And as far as where is the industry, I feel like we've reached a plateau, if I'm being honest, where it's ups and down, strikes and gutters, ebbs and flows. We're kind of in a little bit of a lull, I would say, probably. But that's just partly just what's happening in the world. So, but it's an industry that's been around. If Chateau Moussard can make vintage, they make, I think with the whole war, the civil war in Lebanon, they talk about making wine with, artillery shells dropping on their vineyard. They still did. I think they made wine in every vintage except one or two, and that kind of perseverance. And that, wine will find a way. I feel like that, we come through. And so as long as people have kind of the enthusiasm and desire to do it, which I see, just kind of looking at who you'd interviewed. There's so many people I didn't recognize, but listening to some of them who kind of started after me, I'm like, man, they have that same kind of feeling. Seeing interns come in and like they want to go taste everywhere, and they want to, go to the harvest parties and meet everyone and ask you 1,000 questions. And I remember that. And I'm like, that's great, man. Yes, go out there and just go see and do and carry that fire, carry it. So, and if I'm being honest, I'm trying to get that back a little, like my time in the wilderness, working with Andrew has helped, but it's like I need to get where I'm like, no, man, I need to start, contributing and making my own or doing something kind of more in line with where I'm at. So that's where I'm at, which is probably kind of, corollary to where the industry's at to a degree,
Yeah. All right. All the questions that I have for you today. Anything I didn't ask that I should have? Anything we didn't talk about today that you're hoping to talk about?
Not really, Rich. I will just say credit to you guys, having an oral history, being a history major and being fascinated by history. Like, this is a great thing. And like, I had not really looked at what you guys had done and some of the people, And it's funny, I listen to podcasts, but I've, what's the other big one? I'll drink to that. Like, when I look at that and look at you guys, like the resources in there. If I'm an MW student or a young person, like, man, the things you can glean from this is just amazing. And again, going forward for posterity, this kind of thing, like I would love to go back and listen to, like Armand Rousseau talk about fermenting, or Anselm Salos, like hearing those kind of, those kind of things. So the fact that you guys are doing it, I think, my hat's off to you. And thanks for having me on. This has been, I've enjoyed it. So
thank you for the kind words, and thank you for being part of this today. It's been a really fun project, and we've really enjoyed it. So thank you for sharing your story with us today. Thanks for joining us here, and we'll go ahead and let you off the hook. Thank you.
Thanks, Rich.